information in Rhododendron.
Okay, so I am actually not going to talk entirely about the work that's in the paper, that's in the special issue. I am going to talk a little bit about it, but if you want to know more about that, you can read my paper when it comes out. What I am going to talk about is some work that my student Fiona Duong has been doing. And basically what we did is took some of Fiona's work and all the other work we've done in Rhododendron, and we put it all together, and this is a really fun story. So I hope you guys by the end will believe me that we need to keep expecting the unexpected. So this work is really grounded in one of the most highly cited papers in the special issue, which is leaf economics theory. And you guys all know this, plants that have higher specific leaf area or have more leaf area per unit carbon also have other traits that are very closely related. They tend to have higher leaf nitrogen content, so they can grow fast. They have higher rates of gas exchange, and there's some evidence that they have a faster growth rate, i.e. they're acquisitive. But there's also a trade-off. These leaves have a shorter leaf lifespan and lower stress resistance. And the idea is that a jack of all trades is a master of none. I'm going to come back to this because this is really interesting in my study system. On top of the leaf economic spectrum, there's this idea that there's a whole plant economic spectrum. And from an evolutionary perspective, this is really important because you may have a great leaf, but if you have crummy roots, you are still dead. And so it's really about how all the pieces are combined. And coming at it from a hydraulics perspective, there's been this long-standing idea about plant architecture and how plant architecture actually mediates the relationships between traits. So plants that have higher SLA should also have leaf anatomy that allows faster uptake. They should have higher water transport capacity, more absorbing root length per carbon. In fact, they should have a coordinated suite of acquisitive traits. All right, so what I did is I thought about this in terms of genus Rhododendron. So it's a highly speciose, 800 to 1,000 species, distributed pretty much all across the northern hemisphere. Sorry, southern hemisphere people. But basically, I've been working in 3 clades, the deciduous Pentanthera, semi-evergreen Tsutsutsui, and evergreen Ponticum. And the idea is that you have your acquisitive clade and you move down to your conservative clade. So we looked at 27 different species. This shows the distribution of the species that we looked at in the yellow dots. They're from a wide variety of climates, so you have a lot of diversity. And we looked at these species growing in 2 botanical gardens, here at the Holden Arboretum near Cleveland and at the Species Foundation in Seattle. So all of this work was done on the same plants, and we collected a lot of traits together, and I'll show you how they all fit together. So I'm going to ask, do species with higher SLA have leaf anatomy for rapid uptake, higher water transport, more absorbing root per carbon? In fact, a suite of acquisitive traits. So first let's look at leaf anatomy for rapid uptake. The deciduous clade has variation in SLA within it. And so does the evergreen clade. We expect differences across the clades, but if we look within a clade, we should see that there's changes across SLA within and across clades. And what we expect is that more acquisitive species will have a thinner epidermis, thicker palisade, and thinner airspace so that they can rapidly acquire. And we expect their midrib vessels to be larger in diameter and more midrib vessels because this would have a larger water supply to this really acquisitive leaf. Well, in fact, we did not find all of these things were true. Unexpectedly, everything is driven by more epidermis and less total xylem area in acquisitive species. So they had a thicker epidermis, which seems counterintuitive. It uses a lot of carbon and it doesn't photosynthesize. And they had similar sized palisades. They had thinner airspace as we predicted. And their xylem vessels were larger, meaning they could have a larger water supply, but they actually had a smaller total xylem area than less acquisitive species. So the epidermis really is interesting because when you think about it, if you're really acquisitive, you don't want to leak any of your water. You want to make sure you save it for transpiration. And this clade is actually from a higher light rhododendron is all very tiny. They have some of the smallest xylem conduits on planet Earth, and they're very uniformly small. So what we're looking at is these species tend to be water limited. So if you're going to be acquisitive, you got to conserve water, and I think that's why they have a larger, thicker epidermis. So do species with higher SLA have higher water transport capacity? I just answered that a little bit, but now let's look in the stem xylem. So these are the data that are in that paper in the special issue. Basically what we found is that xylem actually differs in a lot of unexpected ways. We found that deciduous species had larger vessel diameters in the stem, just as we found in the midrib xylem. But we also found that the evergreens, the conservative species, had larger total vessel area in the stem. So our data from midribs and stem xylem really compare. This is the coolest clade, the semi-evergreens. And this is where I start to come back to the jack of all trades as a master of none. When does it make sense to be in the middle? In fact, the trade-off theory suggests that it never makes sense to be in the middle, and you should be pushed towards the ends. Now, our semi-evergreens had a high water transport per unit leaf area. In fact, the highest in the clade. And not only that, but they had really, really high variability in their specific leaf area along the branch. So for the deciduous species, their leaves were really uniform. In fact, across 2 botanical gardens of 8 species and 27 plants, they all made 4 to 9 leaves per branch. And they were all almost exactly the same. Whereas the semi-evergreens had a lot of variation in SLA along the branch. And surprisingly, the evergreens also had a lot of variation in SLA along the branch. So what's going on here? Well, I think these deciduous plants are actually maximizing the rate of water transport. So when they're going to use water, they're going to do it really fast. That makes sense in an acquisitive sense. The evergreens, on the other hand, are maximizing their total leaf area. They have more total xylem so that they're getting this steady stream of water supply for those larger leaf areas that they have. The semi-evergreens are the coolest ones, though. What they're doing is they're actually maximizing function per unit leaf area. And they come from highly variable environments that see a lot of drought. So I think they're sort of like a snake. They're real quiet and conservative, but when it's time to eat, they're ready. So maybe this is not intermediate after all. All right, so now let's look at our root data. Do acquisitive species have more absorbing roots per carbon? This was a paper that was in American Journal of Botany in 2017. And the answer really depends on who you ask. Deciduous species had a lot of absorbing tips per unit carbon as SLA increased. In other words, they had a lot more little ends of their roots when they wanted to go fast. The semi-evergreens had a lot more absorbing length per carbon as SLA increased. In other words, when they want to grow fast, they explore. So this is more about a foraging strategy that's precision, and this is a foraging strategy that is exploratory. Now, the evergreens, we saw no relationship to SLA. Their roots are actually really, really diverse. We found no evidence that they relate to their leaf traits. And we think this is a mycorrhizal story, which I think is my next slide. Yeah, okay. So we've done some work that I'm not going to show today, but we think this is a mycorrhizae story. So I really enjoyed that talk earlier, trying to relate microbial communities to traits. All right, so let's get to, so the answer, is there more absorbing root per carbon? Yes, but how do you define acquisitive? Is it when you have more tips or more length? Both could be an acquisitive strategy. So now let's get to the heart of the problem. Is there a suite of acquisitive traits? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to be showing you results of a phylogenetic PCA, and we're just going to take all those things I just showed you and look at them in relation to one another. So what we find first is that we do recover evidence for leaf economic spectrum in rhododendron. We see a trade-off between the specific leaf area and the carbon-nitrogen ratio as expected. No-brainer. We do see that for leaf tissue proportions, epidermis, look at how tightly it's correlated with specific leaf area. This is the trait that explains SLA in the rhododendrons that we studied. We also see that Palisade had that negative relationship, not unexpectedly, and airspace had a negative relationship, as we would expect. For xylem vessel anatomy, we see that actually the stem vessel diameter really is highly related to SLA compared to other traits. But these midrib vessel traits are tangential. And that's really interesting because those are in the leaf. So you'd think they'd be more related, but they're not. And the midrib vessel area basically trades off. So things that have more vessel area have smaller diameters. All right, this is where things like get super cool to me. I'm going to just geek out a little bit. Okay, here's the leaf economic spectrum on PC1. We recover completely orthogonal to that, the roots. Okay, so there's a trade-off between having long roots and having fat roots. First order diameter is larger when you have less length. That's not surprising. Here's where it gets really surprising is when we start to look at the other things that are along this axis that are not related to leaf economics. And that is, first, plant architecture. That's plant architecture. So what we see is that leaf size and number are actually pretty orthogonal to each other. There's a classic idea in ecology that you should have a trade-off between size and number, but what we see here is they vary independently within the genus. And this is really important when you think back to the water supply and those semi-evergreens that had their highly variable leaves. You could actually change the number of leaves and the size of the leaves, and that could change how much water you're getting supplied from this rather low water supply zone. But this is my favorite result, actually. What we did is we actually measured variation along the branch in SLA, and we calculated the variance using the coefficient of variation. And what do you say when I say that this variation in SLA is really perfectly correlated with first order root diameter? So I would say we need to keep expecting the unexpected. Oh, I have 2 minutes. All right. Whoops, go back. I'm not going to rush through this. This is the fun part. These are the species. You see a lot of variation across the species in the space. What we see is, again, the deciduous and the evergreens are defined by the leaf economic spectrum. But those semi-evergreens are doing something totally different. Sometimes they're like a deciduous, sometimes they're like an evergreen. And maybe they're mastering different trades at different times. And lastly, we find that these ecologically diverse evergreens are not defined, they're not characterized by the leaf economic spectrum. They're actually diversified across this root plant architecture spectrum. And so on the one end, we've got species with large leaves, lots of xylem transport, and low variation in the leaves. On the other hand, you have things with small leaves, high leaf variation. And this is actually related to a lot of root tip abundance. All right, so do species have a suite of acquisitive traits? Yes, but traits actually vary in multiple dimensions. And I really want to stress that whole plant functional trait coordination is showing within our studies to be a really important aspect of rhododendron diversity. And I want you to keep expecting the unexpected. And with that, I'd like to thank all these wonderful people, especially Fiona, who collected all the leaf anatomy data. And if I have time, I will take a question.
You do. One question.
Best question ever, yeah.
I don't know about that, but when you were measuring the water transport, were you doing the theoretical hydraulic transport, based on the Hagen-Poiseuille rule, or you?
I did not calculate Hagen-Poiseuille. We just basically looked at diameter and total area. We decided to do morphology and anatomy first, and now all of this is informing like a million actual measuring hydraulics hypotheses.
Because it scales by the 4th power of the radius.
These things are
big xylem could be transporting a lot more water than a lot of small xylem.
These are all about 17 microns. That's it. All of them. All the conduit. Very small conduit.